All right. Thanks everyone for joining me today. My name is Dr. Melissa Esmacher. I am one of the two full-time history professors at Northwest Campus. And I'm really excited today to talk about the feminist history of Wonder Woman and the Marvels. Um, so I decided to do this presentation originally a couple of years ago ahead of Captain Marvel coming out, the first solo film featuring Captain Marvel, because I noticed when I was reading a little bit more about the history and the background of that character, I noticed that there were a lot of parallels between um, feminism and the way it develops in the United States and the creation of certain superheroes. So even though there are lots of fantastic female superheroes that we could profile, today we're going to focus mainly on three of them because I feel like their creation is most connected to different waves of feminism in American history. So we're going to focus today mainly on Wonder Woman, Captain Marvel, and Ms. Marvel. Okay, so no shade to other superheroes. I'd love to expand in a future presentation and feature, for example, the women of the X-Men. All right, so if you are really interested in the history of female superheroes, I can recommend two great books for you that helped give me background information for this talk. One is The Secret History of Wonder Woman by the historian Jill Lepore. Don't let the size put you off. It is a rather hefty book, but it's a great source of information. It's a biography, not just of the character of Wonder Woman, but also her creators, who we're going to talk more about today. And then the other book that gives an overview of different characters is Superwomen, Gender, Power, and Representation by Carolyn Coca. This is a collection of essays on different characters, and I highly recommend both books. They're pretty easy reads, they're pretty fun reads. So those are the kind of two main scholarly sources I used in preparing this presentation. All right, so let's get into it and let's start. We're going to go chronologically in time. We're going to start first with Wonder Woman, who is the OG when it comes to female superheroes. So Wonder Woman is created by a man named William Moulton Marston. Marston is a psychologist. In fact, he's one of the first psychology professors when psychology gets established as an academic field at universities. He is also an inventor. He is one of the first people to invent technology that's today known as the lie detector. So a very colorful and varied life. And Marston, his interest in comic books came because he saw how popular they were in the 1930s, especially among children. And he felt that there was not enough female representation in the comic books of the 1930s. And so he decided that there should be a female superhero. And he was inspired by his partners, Elizabeth Holloway Marston and Olive Byrne. So yes, I said partners plural. He was legally married to Elizabeth Holloway Marston, but they were a throuple. They were in a joint relationship. Both women had kids with Marston, and they had a very unconventional relationship for the 1930s. And he was very inspired by these two women who were very strong-willed, very passionate, very educated women. In fact, Olive Byrne was a former student of Marston's at university. And he wanted to create a female superhero to educate and inspire children, particularly that they could solve their problems, not just with violence, with like fists and firepower, but also love and reason, which he felt were strengths of women in general. Marston ends up working with Max Gaines from National Periodicals, as well as with All American Publications. Those two companies will later merge to become DC Comics. And Marston and Gaines write together the first Wonder Woman comics under a pen name, Charles Moulton. Now, to bring Wonder Woman to life, Marston recruits an illustrator named H.G. Peter, and you see some of his initial character sketches for Wonder Woman here on the slide. H.G. Peter prior to this, he was an unconventional pick for a comic book artist because most of his work up until that point had been done in political cartoons, newspaper editorials. Okay, so not comic books. But we're going to talk for in a minute why Marston chose H.G. Peter in particular. And H.G. Peter is actually going to work on the Wonder Woman comics longer than Marston does. He's going to continue to illustrate the Wonder Woman comics until 1958. So when he was interviewed about the creation of Wonder Woman and asked why he felt her character was important in 1943, this is what he had to say. Marston said, "Not even girls want to be girls, so long as our feminine archetype lacks force, strength, and power. Not wanting to be girls, they don't want to be tender, submissive, peace-loving, as good women are. Women's strong qualities have become despised because of their weaknesses. The obvious remedy is to create a feminist character, or excuse me, a feminine character, with all the strength of Superman plus all the allure of a good and beautiful woman." So Marston believed that men and women were distinctly different and they had distinctly positive traits. So he identified women as being far more logical, rational, peace-loving. And so he wanted to promote a character that could be strong and use violence when necessary, but could also, again, motivate people to not choose violence. Now, when Marston created Wonder Woman, he's very deeply influenced by the suffragette movement. So those of you who've taken the first half of American history will remember that following the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, which was the first organized meeting of the women's rights movement in the United States, we have women pushing for the right to vote, what we call suffrage. This is known in American history as first wave feminism. So the focus of the first wave of the women's rights movement is to get women the right to vote. And Marston was raised in an environment that was very pro-suffragette. He also had his wife, Elizabeth Holloway Marston, who had been influenced by the suffragette movement. Olive Byrne, his other partner, was actually the niece of Margaret Sanger, who was a famous birth control activist and the founder of Planned Parenthood. And Olive Byrne's mother, Ethel Byrne, was herself also a birth control activist. So Marston is raised and then is, with his partners, kind of surrounded by strong women who were supporters of the women's rights movement. Now, why he got H.G. Peter as his cartoonist, his illustrator, despite the fact that Peter had no background in comics, was Peter did have a long history in working on pro-suffragette editorial comics for magazines like Judge magazine, which is famous for its political cartoons, when women were pushing for the national right to vote, which was achieved with the 19th Amendment in 1920 in the United States. Now, Peter's visual style is very heavily influenced by another illustrator named Lou Rogers. So here you see two illustrations. On the left, we have a pro-suffragette cartoon by Lou Rogers. On the right, we have a pro-suffragette cartoon, or not a pro-suffragette cartoon, a Wonder Woman cell by H.G. Peter. Lou Rogers was a pioneer. She was a female political cartoonist at a time when it was a very male-dominated profession. And Rogers frequently worked with Peter for Judge magazine in the 19-teens. So there's a very heavy artistic debt, inspiration that Peter owes to Rogers, especially in the style of drawing Wonder Woman. And you can see here the symbolism of the chains, which is something we're going to come back to shortly, that these chains kind of represent different ways that women are oppressed, right? And you have the woman in Rogers' cartoon sort of enveloped by those chains, trying to break them off. And then you have Wonder Woman literally ripping off these chains that bind her. So Wonder Woman as a character was first debuted in All-Star Comics number 8 in 1941. So she's sort of soft launched in another superheroes comic. She's going to get her own original title in 1942. Okay. So, how is Wonder Woman introduced as a character? This is really interesting. So, the background of Wonder Woman, her origin story in her original comic, is that she is sculpted out of clay by the Amazon queen Hippolyta, who then brings that sculpture to life. And Diana, as her name is originally, is given superpowers by the Greek gods. And Wonder Woman in her original comic in 1942, I'm going to go back for a second, because you can see the panel here. Wonder Woman, her original comic, the action that takes place is that an American fighter pilot named Steve Trevor crash lands into the Amazon's home island of Themyscira, and Wonder Woman wins the right versus the other Amazons to take Steve back to what they called the man's world to fight the Nazis, because 1942, World War II is happening. So who are the Amazons that Wonder Woman belongs to? Here, Marston is tapping into Greek mythology. So ancient Greek mythology had this idea of a culture of female warriors that they nicknamed the Amazons. And Marston picks the Amazons for two reasons. Number one, if you're tapping into Greek mythology, that opens the Pandora's box of different stories and characters and influences you can bring into future stories. Number two, you also have a long history of the suffragettes, the first wave feminists, being very influenced by these Amazons and making the argument that this all-female warrior society represented an alternative because it was a matriarchy, a society run by women, in contrast to a patriarchy, a society run by men, which most cultures today are still very heavily patriarchal. Now, Amazons, do they actually ever exist outside of Greek mythology? The answer is kind of. So the Greeks loosely based the legends of the Amazons off of nomads from Central Asia that they called the Scythians, where men and women both engaged in combat. They had a more egalitarian or equal culture. And so the Greeks thought that was kind of cool because the Greeks were a heavily patriarchal society. And so they kind of create this story about this female warrior society. For her creators, the other function of setting Wonder Woman's background in this female warrior society based on Greek myth is to contrast how peaceful the Amazons are on a daily basis, even though they're ready to fight, versus what's going on in the world, because we're in 1942. It's the middle of World War II. And so there's lots of concerns about just the violence of warfare. So in Wonder Woman's original comic run, we see her as very strong, very empowered. There's a lot of times where she appears in chains. These chains are very symbolic. Like I said, it is a nod back to suffragette art, where chains were often depicted to talk about how constricted women were by patriarchal society. And Wonder Woman oftentimes has this like breaking apart of chains as a very prominent visual theme. This made some comic book editors in the 1940s very nervous because they were a little worried that they were introducing children to bondage play with the depiction of these chains. And so they kept pleading Marston and Peter to like tone down the chains in the Wonder Woman comics. What I love about the visual style of Wonder Woman in the 1940s is she is depicted exactly the same way that male superheroes like Superman and Batman, who were relatively new characters, were depicted at the time. For example, you see here in the panel at the right, Wonder Woman saving a man, right? She's not the damsel in distress. She is the rescuer of this man. And Wonder Woman's story and her release in early 1942 really hits at just the right time. At this time, the United States, her comic is released in January of 1942. So the United States is only a month into World War II. Okay, the United States joins in the war in December of 1941. So this highlights the power of women. Women at home in the United States are enlisting in the armed forces and female-only auxiliary units. So about 400,000 women are going to sign up and serve in uniform during World War II. Women also, a far larger number of women stay behind and work in war industries. So you see that in this propaganda picture on the right of the slide. Already a month into World War II, in January 1942, when Wonder Woman's issue drops, 2.8 million women are working in war industries. And that number is just going to explode during the war. So women are inhabiting roles in the workplace that they never were before. Women during peacetime generally did not join the military at this time. Women did not do jobs like welding or riveting. Those were traditionally reserved for men, but because of the shortage of labor due to the draft, women are stepping up and they're taking on these more powerful roles. So the character of Wonder Woman fits right into this dynamic of women stepping up and taking on extra responsibilities and kicking ass while doing it. Now, after World War II ends, the narrative that was pushed in a lot of propaganda during World War II that was pitched towards women was that women were doing these kinds of jobs temporarily, that this was not supposed to be a permanent social change, that women were just working or serving so that their husbands, brothers, sons, etc., could come back home quicker. And the expectation was as soon as the war is done, women give up their positions in the military, they give up their jobs in industry, and go back to being traditional homemakers. And so once we get to the 1950s, gender roles in American society become much more conservative, with the idea of the male breadwinner working outside the home and the woman staying at home, either keeping the house, raising kids, etc. And we see that throughout 1950s pop culture, in which women are oftentimes, especially in advertising, depicted as finding fulfillment in the latest domestic gadgets like dishwashers or fancy fridges. And we see this bleed into Wonder Woman's character in the 50s as well. Part of it is because Marston dies of cancer in 1947. And as long as Marston was alive, he insisted on a very feminist depiction of Wonder Woman. And even though Peter was also on board with that as the illustrator rather than the writer, he had less influence over the storylines. Marston's partners were more silent partners, so they didn't really have a say in the depiction of Wonder Woman. And those two women, by the way, Elizabeth and Olive, remained together until the death of Elizabeth decades later. And so when we look at depictions of Wonder Woman in the 1950s, this is very different than we saw the panels about Wonder Woman in the 40s. Wonder Woman is given much more of a backseat role in her own comic book. The storyline shift to give more power and control to Steve Trevor. You can see here on the right a reversal of that image we saw during the 1940s. Here, Wonder Woman is the damsel in distress being carried. A lot of these storylines emphasize that Wonder Woman wants to get married to Steve Trevor, and her comic books start having these little inserts, these little supplements focused on romance and marriage. And those supplements will be in Wonder Woman comic books for about 20 years. So very much this messaging to young girls who are reading this Wonder Woman comic in the 1950s is that they should desire a life of domesticity. That is the ideal, the golden standard. What's also weird is that Wonder Woman's origin story changes. So now, rather than being created by Hippolyta from clay, Wonder Woman's story is retconned into being she's the daughter of Hippolyta and a shipwrecked mortal man, that she is no longer created just by a woman. And during the 1950s, we're also, speaking of female comic book characters, going to see the introduction of both Batwoman and Batgirl in the 50s and 60s. Um, the reasons that Batwoman and Batgirl were introduced were not rah-rah feminism reasons. Um, they were specifically introduced because of allegations that comic books were corrupting the youth. In 1954, Frederick Wertham's Seduction of the Innocent came out. And in his book, he charged that comics were corrupting kids, that they were causing juvenile delinquency, and they were encouraging young people to be queer. And he sort of alleged that, like, Batman and Robin, like, were they gay? Were they a couple? Right. And so Batwoman and Batgirl are introduced as love interests for Batman and Robin, to kind of tamp down that sort of rumor mongering that they were gay, that they were homoerotic. And so there's lots of anxiety, cultural anxiety about comic books and their influence on kids. And so that's another thing that we see in this sort of general social conservatism in the 1950s. By the time we get to the 1960s, we have the birth of what's known as the second wave of feminism in the United States. Since women had gained the right to vote in 1920, there had been a big question of what next. And nobody could really agree on one particular direction for the movement to go. And so it kind of stalled out until 1963. So 1963 is popularly credited as the birth year of second wave feminism in the United States because that's the year that Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, is published. In this book, Friedan criticizes this notion that all women have to find fulfillment and satisfaction in a life of domesticity. She also points out how limited women are in terms of economic, social, educational, political activities and opportunities. And so this kickstarts second wave feminists. So we have the founding of groups like NOW, the National Organization of Women, which you see referenced in the picture on the left. And during the 1960s and into the 1970s, second wave feminists pushed for equal access to education. Title IX gets its start in 1972, originally to help promote equal access to higher education for women, although today it's much more expansive than that. Feminists also push for more opportunities in employment. For example, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in employment. And they even propose a new amendment to the Constitution, an Equal Rights Amendment, which would specifically state that men and women were equal. And while that amendment was proposed originally in 1972 with bipartisan support by both Republicans and Democrats, unfortunately, it's given a 10-year timetable to be approved, which is highly unusual for adding constitutional amendments. Usually they don't have an expiration date. It fails to get approved in the timetable, and so we don't have an Equal Rights Amendment in the Constitution today. So by 1982, the Equal Rights Amendment is dead, although there was some kerfuffle about it in early 2025, but that's not relevant to today's discussion. All right. So this second wave of feminism directly inspires the creation of our next female superhero, Carol Danvers. Now notice I'm starting with her government name here, right? Her secret identity, because Carol Danvers is going to undergo many name changes in her career as a superhero. So the character of Carol Danvers was introduced in 1968. She was not a main character at the time. She was introduced as a potential love interest for the character Captain Marvel. So the original Captain Marvel was a male. He was a Kree superhero living on Earth. And Carol Danvers makes her debut in the comic as the head of security at a military base. So she represented a second wave feminist, a believer in equality of women, that she had worked to get to this position of authority within the military. And she kind of simmers as a background character. Okay? So when she gets promoted to main player is 1977. So in 1977, her character is promoted to the big leagues. She becomes known as the superhero Ms. Marvel. So the origin story of her getting her superpowers is that she had been exposed to radiation during a battle between Captain Marvel and the villainous Yon-Rogg. So this battle between Kree superpowered individuals. And that so basically her getting superpowers was just an afterthought, an accident. Um, One of the reasons why Marvel decided to embark on this storyline with Carol Danvers was number one, due to protecting trademarks. Number two, as a way to capitalize on the popularity of second wave feminism. One of the original writers of Ms. Marvel, Jerry Conway, said Ms. Marvel, because of her name, if nothing else, is influenced to a great extent by the move towards women's liberation. She's not a Marvel girl, she's a woman. Not a Miss or a Mrs., a Ms., her own person. So Ms., the title Ms., MS, was promoted by second wave feminism as a alternative title, because if you think about it, the default titles we use in English, Miss and Mrs., indicate marital status. So Ms. was meant as sort of a more neutral title for women by second wave feminists. And in these early issues of Ms. Marvel, they're kind of rough. The writer, Jerry Conway, really beats you over the head with second wave feminism, and to the point where readers of the Ms. Marvel comic said, "Hey man, like you don't understand women. You're not a woman. You know, you're writing in a way that reveals that you don't really get second wave feminism." And the reason we know this is the response is during this time period in the 60s, 70s, 80s, comic books would print letters to the editor and letters to the author in the comics. And so we see this evidence of all of these women writing and going, this is a really cool idea for a character. Can you write her better? And Marvel listens and brings in a new writer, Chris Claremont, and a new editor, Archie Goodwin, after issue number 8. In the first couple of issues, Conway, who's the original writer, depicted Carol and Ms. Marvel as almost split identities. That Ms. Marvel was kind of like the Kree warrior, more masculine. Carol was more traditionally feminine. And so the first 7 issues kind of have her struggling between these two parts of herself. When Claremont takes over, he promotes a more sort of unified, he doesn't completely deviate from the storyline, but talks about how, yes, she's kind of got this split personality, but they learn from each other, they attempt to integrate. And Claremont introduces much more backstory for Carol Danvers, that she had worked hard to be taken seriously as a woman in the military. She'd achieved a lot of what she did through hard work and determination. And the Ms. Marvel series runs until 1979. The 1970s is a pretty cool age for female superheroes. We see the introduction of new X-Men characters that are female, like my personal favorite, Storm, who's introduced in 1975. And Wonder Woman gets a boost in popularity because of a TV show. So the Wonder Woman TV show runs from 1975 to 1979 and stars Linda Carter, who's pictured here. Originally, the pilot of the show was set during World War II to be true to the comics origins, but that was a little bit too expensive on the budget for costume and design, and so they transported her to the current day, then the 70s. Now, Carter gets her flowers. She gets recognized for portraying Wonder Woman in a great, nuanced way. However, look at her costume. I don't know about you, but I would not want to go fighting crime in that bustier. Okay. She doesn't look very secure. This is the era in the 1970s where there's a lot of that kind of style. Women dress more provocatively, leading 1970s primetime TV to get the derisive nickname Jiggle TV. And even though it's a great show, not a whole lot of people took it seriously because of the visuals, despite Linda Carter being a fantastic actress. The 1970s also adds a relative for Wonder Woman, a long-lost twin sister named Nubia. Nubia is really, really interesting. She's introduced in Wonder Woman 204 in 1973, and technically she is DC's first female Black superhero. So here's the origin story. How does Wonder Woman have a Black twin sister? Well, according to the comic where she's introduced, she and Diana were both sculpted out of clay by Hippolyta, obviously different colors of clay to explain their skin tone being different. But Nubia had been kidnapped by Ares, the god of war, okay, when she was a baby. And so Nubia had been raised by Ares in what was called the floating island. So this was a complete mirror image of Themyscira, a society completely dominated by men. And so the story went that she and Wonder Woman fought each other, and Nubia was actually victorious with her magical sword. Take that as you will, a magical sword in a all-male society. And then she is supposed to support Ares in attacking the Amazons, but decides to change sides and support her long-lost sister. So Nubia is introduced at a time when we also have the Black Civil Rights Movement and Black Power. So she's both tapping into second wave feminism as well as the Civil Rights Movement. But DC doesn't really seem to know what to do with her. So her character undergoes several reboots over the years. When DC has their Crisis on Infinite Earths event in 1985, her character is completely erased. She's rebooted in 1999 as not even related to Wonder Woman anymore. She's depicted as an Amazonian champion from before Diana's creation named Nubia, who had been sent to guard the door to Hades or Hell, and had been presumed lost. And then also weirdly, she hooks up with Ahura Mazda, who is a Zoroastrian god. So those of anybody taking world history, that's a little kind of weird to mix your Greek mythology with Zoroastrianism. And in 2021, Nubia's character is rebooted again in the form of a graphic novel, a one-off graphic novel called Nubia, Real One, written by two Black women. L.L. McKinney is the writer and Robin Smith is the artist. This novel is geared towards a young adult audience, and it depicts Nubia as a Black teenage girl in the United States with these superpowers, including super strength, and how she exists in a world that still sees her Blackness, her femininity, her strength as threatening. Okay. So that's a lot to say about commentary more on contemporary American society than it has to do with Greek mythology. Now, once we get into the 1980s, there's a backlash to second wave feminism. US politics gets more conservative. This is the decade where Ronald Reagan is president. And there is a pushback against feminism that we see spill over into comics, most notoriously with a storyline in Avengers 200 involving Carol Danvers. Just as an FYI, I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes talking about assault, which I know can be upsetting for some people. So this is your cue to like tune out for the next 3 minutes or so. I will try to deal with it as sensitively as possible. So in Avengers 200, there's a storyline in which Carol Danvers is assaulted and impregnated by a character named Marcus. And this storyline, which is already weird to begin with, and it will get weirder in a second when I tell you what comes of this storyline, but weirdly, this storyline was shoehorned into the issue. It wasn't originally even supposed to be there, but the editor-in-chief at Marvel Comics, Jim Shooter, insisted that it be put in for reasons that we still don't fully understand. So in this storyline, Carol is assaulted, she's impregnated, and because Marcus is an alien being, the pregnancy is like super sped up, okay, not the normal 9 months. And in this storyline, the Avengers repeatedly show more concern for Carol's unborn child than they do Carol herself. as she's trying to process being assaulted and impregnated, where she's expressing anger and confusion over what's happened to her. In the story, she gives birth to the baby, which weirdly, because comics is also her assaulter. So like her assaulter impregnates her with himself. It's really weird. So her assaulter slash son, and again, alien, he grows up magically quickly, and the storyline has her falling in love with her assaulter slash son and leaving the Avengers to pursue a romantic relationship. All levels of weird. I mean, we know comic books can get kind of strange, but it's really weird, right? And it really outraged a lot of people because of who Carol Danvers was, right? She was introduced as this like icon of second wave feminism, and now she's essentially written off after an assault. And this provoked a lot of outrage among readers and the publication of a famous essay by Carol Strickland called The Rape of Ms. Marvel, which not only protested the storyline, but how they handled it, right? And this also upset Chris Claremont, who was that second writer on Ms. Marvel. And so he actually writes Ms. Marvel back into the Uncanny X-Men series, which he is writing for, in 1981 as a way to reclaim her character and kind of gain some narrative control over the character of Carol Danvers. So as he writes her back in to the Uncanny X-Men in 1981, her first entry into this series is rough. She's attacked by Rogue, who is then a villain. And Rogue, because of her powers, right, absorbing other people's powers and memories, essentially Carol Danvers gets stripped of her powers and stripped of her memories. What a way to be written back in. Okay. So throughout the 80s and 90s, poor Carol Danvers, she goes through it. Okay. She eventually regains some powers and some new powers. She undergoes some name changes, briefly becoming known as Binary. And then in the 1990s, the character Warbird. During this time, she's depicted as turning to alcoholism as a way to kind of cope with all of the trauma of assault and losing her powers and everything else that's happened to her. And she's going to undergo one more name change, okay? But she started as Ms. Marvel, then went to Binary, then went to Warbird, right? She goes through the ringer, okay, through the 80s and 90s as a character. Female superheroes in general have a hard time in the 1990s. There are some bright spots, particularly Wonder Woman during the 1980s has a run by the writer George Perez, or excuse me, the artist George Perez, who takes over drawing Wonder Woman after the Crisis on Infinite Earths event until 1992, and he is a feminist. But for the most part, as you can see by some of these illustrations from the 90s, comics changes a lot in the 1990s. Part of it is because the way that people are buying comics is different. Up until this point, from like the 1930s when Marston creates Wonder Woman to the 90s, for the most part, comics books were sold at your local like drugstore, at the grocery store. I remember as a kid, even in the 90s, still being able to buy the odd comic book at the grocery store when my mom was shopping. But for the most part, comic books start disappearing from those very common places. And instead, most people now are buying comic books either at comic book stores or directly subscribing and getting these comics sent in the mail to them from DC and Marvel. This means that the average person buying comics in the 1990s is an older, heterosexual, white male. And so what this means is the comic industry starts catering to what these guys want to see. And 3 guesses what these guys want to see looking at the sampling of images from the 1990s. They want to see women's bodies. Okay. This is what we call the bad girl style of art. The selections that you see here. This is also seen as a sort of response, not just to second wave feminism, but third wave feminism, which starts in the late 1980s and emphasizes intersectionality. The bad girls style of art is drawing women in ways that make them objects rather than active actors. They're shown in very scanty clothing, as you can see in the image on the left. They're illustrated in poses that are physically impossible. The center panel with Wonder Woman here, that is called the broke back pose, because there's no way in hell with a normal back you can actually twist that way. Your back would have to be broken for you to be able to have that pose. Okay, it's physically impossible. And then also, male illustrators don't seem to know how spandex works, as we see here in the panel on the right. Generally, spandex squishes boobs down rather than perfectly conforming to them, as we see here in this illustration. But again, it's not about accuracy of physics or poses or the way that certain fabrics work. It's about appealing to an audience that wants that sex appeal. Okay. Wonder Woman as a character, her writing during this time period is very frequently not as feminist. Wonder Woman goes through, in the many decades she's been a character in comics and popular media, she kind of goes through this roller coaster of depictions where when society is more egalitarian, progressive, Wonder Woman's depicted as more powerful and potentially queer, given that she comes from an island full of women. And then when things are more conservative, Wonder Woman's feminism is downplayed and her potential queerness is downplayed. Okay, while her sexuality is overemphasized. All right. Now, things do start to change around the year 2000 because of the internet. The internet is going to expose an untapped market for comic books. First of all, we do have a run of more feminist writers writing on the Wonder Woman comic, like Phil Jimenez, Greg Rucka, Gail Simone, who give her a much more feminist and nuanced depiction, even though she's also depicted on animated TV series as more sort of like violent and one note. Similar thing happens to Ms. Marvel. There is a run of Ms. Marvel comics between 2006 and 2010, which is really great. But then her depiction, again, on TV series is kind of like one note. But what's really cool about the internet is it enables much more instantaneous communication between the creators and the consumers of these comic books. And we already talked a little bit about that conversation with the letters published in comic books in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but we're going to see a lot more instant and direct feedback from fans to these authors on internet message boards. And this is going to result in a change for Carol Danvers. Carol Danvers is going to undergo her currently last name change to Captain Marvel in a new series that launches in 2012. So this new series is written by Kelly Sue DeConnick, and this series was explicitly created to depict Carol Danvers in light of what we call third wave feminism. So third wave feminism is still focused on women's equality, but also really focused on including all women, regardless of race, ethnicity, sexuality, racial identity, etc. Just all women, okay? All women are included. And as to why she underwent a name change, the Marvel editor overseeing this series, Steve Wacker, said changing the name was not a change we took lightly, and in fact debated it internally at Marvel for years. With all due respect to the Ms. Marvel name, it's a different era. To me, it made sense given her military background and the importance of Carol to feel part of something bigger. We want the comic and character to be inspired by that same consuming need to fly higher and faster than those who came before. So Captain Marvel as a comic book run emphasizes female power, relationships, very intersectional in its depiction. And in fact, DeConnick brings back an older character, Monica Rambeau, who technically holds the title as the first Captain Marvel. She was introduced as Captain Marvel, an unrelated character to Ms. Marvel, back in 1982, and used that name until 1996 when Monica Rambeau becomes known as Photon, which is how she's known in the MCU today. Monica's power was the ability to change her body into energy after she was bombarded by extra Yeah, extra dimensional energy. In the 2019 Captain Marvel film, she's depicted as a young girl. And then in subsequent MCU projects like WandaVision in 2020 and the recent film The Marvels, she's grown up and depicted as gaining superpowers. Okay, and that's kind of also a nod by DeConnick to the fact that Monica Rambeau was the first holder of that Captain Marvel title. The other impact of the internet is that this gives comic book producers more distribution networks. They no longer have to sell to comic book stores. Now people can subscribe to digital delivery of comics, especially popular starting in the 2010s. And this allows comic books to tap into much more diverse demographics in the United States, but also to expand into international markets on a much larger scale than they have before. And the character of Ms. Marvel, yes, a different Ms. Marvel, is an example of how popular a character can become in this new distribution environment. So let's talk about Kamala Khan. Kamala Khan is introduced in the Captain Marvel series as a Muslim American teenager living in New Jersey who idolizes Captain Marvel, and that she becomes a superhero. Okay, herself, she gains powers. Her book, her debut book, is written by G. Willow Wilson, herself a Muslim woman, in 2014, and it becomes so popular that the debut comic goes into 7 printings to meet demand and is among the top 105 issues produced in comics in 2014. And by 2018, Marvel had sold 500,000 trade paperbacks of Ms. Marvel, and her series is one of the top titles on their digital platform. And this is because of the appeal of more diverse audiences. We have people of color, we have international folks, young teenage girls really emphasizing and embracing Kamala's character to the point that she headlines her own show on Disney Plus starting in summer 2022. And the show, for the most part, stays true to the character of Kamala Khan. She's still very obsessed with Captain Marvel, but it does tweak how she gets her powers. It ties her character more explicitly into Captain Marvel with that bangle that she wears of Kree origin. It also ties her into mutants, allowing the MCU to introduce mutants. And it allows for a depiction of a real world event, which is partition of India and Pakistan that happened in the 1940s. So in terms of female superheroes headlining film, Wonder Woman gets her debut in 2017, Captain Marvel in 2019. Wonder Woman gets a sequel, Wonder Woman 84, in 2020. Which unfortunately came out in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then the Marvels film featuring Captain Marvel, Ms. Marvel, and Photon, or Monica Rambeau, comes out in 2023. Okay, so these have been the sequels. They didn't perform as well as the originals, sequelitis. What's really interesting, though, is that some of these films, especially in the MCU, have introduced alternate versions, particularly of Captain Marvel, involving Monica Rambeau's mother, Maria Rambeau. So Maria Rambeau is depicted as Carol's best friend in the movie Captain Marvel, and then she comes back as the alternate version of Captain Marvel in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, and then the alternate version of Binary in the Marvels in 2023. In terms of TV shows, I mentioned that the character of Monica Rambeau gets her superpowers in the series WandaVision. Ms. Marvel, as I already mentioned, had her own series in 2022. It's the one that's probably closest to a comic book and visual style. It's really interesting. But then we have lots of interesting female superheroes that haven't quite made it to film yet. For example, Batgirl was supposed to make it to film. Warner Brothers had commissioned a film that was nearly complete, directed by Adil Al-Arbi and Bilal Fallah, who were directors of multiple episodes of the Ms. Marvel TV show, and it would have starred Leslie Grace, an Afro-Latina, as Batgirl. Unfortunately, the film was canceled by Warner Brothers in August 2022 as a tax write-off. And this sparked a whole wave of conversation about was it canceled because it was headed by a woman, and were there concerns, right, about sexism impacting the film's release and cancelization. And then just kind of as a future to watch, I definitely think great potential in the future for depiction on media is the recently created character of Yara Flor, aka Wonder Girl, who is the daughter of an Amazonian and an indigenous South American. And so she kind of straddles both cultures, and I think it's really interesting. All right, so hopefully you guys have learned a little bit about feminism and how it intersects with superheroes. Like I mentioned, Wonder Woman, Captain Marvel, and Ms. Marvel as characters were all created to respond to different waves of American feminism. And I'm happy at this point in time to answer any questions that you guys might have. If you want to type them in the chat or raise your hand, I'm more than happy to entertain questions. We do have a question about where the recording will be uploaded. I'm going to upload it on my YouTube channel. If you're one of my students, you can message me and I will go ahead and share the recording link with you. If another instructor informed you of this, you can go ahead and contact your instructor, or you can drop me an email. I'll put my email in the chat and I'll send you that link once it's uploaded. Let's see. Oh, Alvaro Ibarra says, I'm from Linda Carter's time. I think I dated myself here. Yeah, it's an interesting show. I definitely want to go back and do a rewatch. I need to figure out if it's streaming anywhere, if I have to get it on DVD. Yes. Okay. Jordan mentions Wonder Woman also had a video game in production that got canceled this year by Warner Brothers. Do they hate money? I think there's still this assumption that female superheroes don't sell. There's still this assumption that the primary audience for video games, for comic books, for comic book movies is male, and that they don't like strong female characters. And I don't think that's true. I think the popularity of Kamala Khan shows that the audience is way more diverse and broad. Okay. All right, Alvaro asked, how does her role as a warrior for peace reflect feminist values? That's a great question. A lot of the first wave feminists basically made the argument that with men in control of societies, we had constant warfare and poverty and famine, and basically that men had screwed things up royally. Why not let women take a shot at this? There was this notion that women were more moral than men. This was kind of the stereotype that women had more virtue than men. And in fact, first wave feminists, the suffragettes, made the argument that women were better qualified or would be better qualified as voters than men because they were inherently more moral. So this idea of Wonder Woman, especially Marston's version, right, where she fights because that is the language that patriarchal society understands, right? She kicks ass. But then she's also promoting this more peaceful way. That's kind of where we're tying in. So remember, Marston still believes in very distinct attributes by gender. Not quite traditional gender roles, but that's kind of where that messaging plays in. Marston is basically saying men have had control for long enough. Let's give women a shot and see whether things will be better. All right. Mariana asks, what did you think of the end game scene where all the women superheroes appear? That's a complicated question because on the one hand, yay, girl power. On the other hand, it felt kind of cheesy, not gonna lie. I think with feminism, we would like to get to a place where that is not uncommon. I think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg was once asked how many female justices on the Supreme Court will be enough. And she said, when there's 9. right? When it's no longer uncommon to see, I think, women in these roles or in significant numbers, that's where we want to be as feminism, right? We want it to have it so that women are so ingrained in society and so equal that it just doesn't even register as distinctly different. So on the one hand, it was cool. On the other hand, it kind of felt like a little pat on the head. There you go. Here's your treat for sticking in here. Girl power. Any other questions? Does Yara Flor proceed or is the end of the wave? Um, Depending upon the feminist scholars you talk to, we're either still in the third wave or in the beginning of a fourth wave. Um, I would argue that Yara Flor is kind of either end of wave 3, beginning of wave 4, if you identify 4 waves. Because in many ways, we still are focusing today in feminism on intersectionality, right? On including all women, not leaving women who are poor, of color, queer, etc. behind. And traditionally, throughout a lot of the history of the women's rights movement in the United States, it's been dominated by white middle and upper class women. And so I think Yara Flor, particularly having her be of part indigenous American heritage, I think that she definitely represents this theme of intersectionality. All right, Gisela asks, do you think Wonder Woman challenges or reinforces traditional gender roles? I think the answer to that question is what era of Wonder Woman, right? Because when Marston created her, even though he had this progressive ideal, he still believed in there being very distinct sort of gender traits, almost kind of like gender essentialism. Um, but there have been more recent runs of Wonder Woman where she is much more what we would today classify as challenging gender roles. So I think it really depends on what era of Wonder Woman that you look at. I really think that Gail Simone, Greg Rucka, Phil Jimenez, their run as Wonder Woman would be kind of closer to pushing those gender roles. Alvaro asks, how does Wonder Woman challenge traditional gender roles in her stories? A lot of times, just her mere existence as a superpowered woman in a room full of non-superpowered men, especially in the original run, makes a huge statement. As I mentioned, her original run, even though Marston clearly writes from a place of thinking of women as distinctly different, maybe in a way that we wouldn't think of as normal today. The way that she's drawn by H.G. Peter is definitely challenging traditional gender roles. Ooh, Jordan asked, any thoughts on Absolute Wonder Woman if you've read it? It changes her backstory. I have not had a chance to read it yet. I decided to go back for another master's degree because I'm a glutton for punishment. And so my to-be read list is ridiculously long. I am hoping to get to that soon because I really, it's been on my radar and I really wanted to look at it, but just didn't get a chance before the re-up on this presentation. So thank you for the recommendation. I'm definitely going to read that. Any other questions? I've got a very brief break in between spring and summer. I'll wedge that in. All right, if there's no other questions, I'll go ahead and stop the recording. If you want to get access to the link when I post it on YouTube so you can watch it later, or if you're a professor on this call, if you want to share that link to your student, just go ahead and email me. I'll put my email again in the chat. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and joining me today. And yeah, have an excellent rest of your day. And let me go ahead and stop the recording.